Welcome everyone to Snippit Sports Science Podcast. This is episode 8. Today we're discussing the paper of post-warm-up muscle temperature maintenance, appeared in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. This came from a group at Loughborough in the UK, or Jared for the American listeners.
I believe we would pronounce that Loughborough.
Okay, so let's get into the paper. What's the paper about?
Yeah, so these researchers have noticed that warm-up, of course, primarily increases muscle temperature. However, as we saw with the swimmers in one of our previous episodes, there's often a 30 to 40 minute period between the warm-up and the competition, and we see that muscle temperature drops during that period. So there's a large interest in maintaining that muscle temperature because they've seen things such as using heated trousers will improve power outputs by as much as 4 to 11%. There is, however, often a 30 to 40 minute period between the warm-up and the competition, which results in a drop in the muscle temperature. One method of overcoming the drop in muscle temperature is to use heated trousers, which they've observed to improve power by 4 to 11%. However, there is still a 1.5 degrees Celsius drop, and so we think that the decrease in muscle temperature could still be attenuated, and we could potentially get even more power output out of that. They believe that this could be due to the cooler central blood coming into the muscle and actually cooling down the muscle, because the rest of the body is cooler, so the central blood temperature drives down the actual muscle temperature.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that's the background behind it. What kind of questions do they try to answer in this paper?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty complicated aims. So the first one that they want to do is they want to look at the role of the core and peripheral blood flow on the muscle temperature. And the way that they're going to do that is they're going to use an occluded limb versus a perfused limb. So with the heating, they're also going to put a tourniquet onto the leg, and they're going to occlude the blood flow from one leg, keeping that warm blood in the leg, versus the other one with no tourniquet, and they'll allow that cooler central blood to come into the leg.
Gotcha.
Is the theory. The second part of that is they'll be comparing whole leg versus just the upper leg being warmed by the trousers. So in one scenario, they'll have the whole leg being heated by the trousers, whereas in the second leg, they essentially have heated shorts rather than actual pants. The third aim that they're looking at is the effect of the heating temperature on the muscle temperature. So they have two different types of trousers that they're looking at. One are 40 degrees electrically heated trousers, and the other are 43 degree water heated trousers.
Right, it's quite warm.
Yeah, quite warm. They did a little pilot testing apparently to try and determine how hot can we make this without causing any skin injuries. And that's what they found was using a 45 degrees Celsius water bath, heating the water trousers up to 43 degrees. That was the absolute maximum temperature that they could use.
Okay. And so what was the hypothesis?
So they hypothesized that the cooler central blood will cool down the muscle temperature. So they hypothesized that the leg with perfusion would decrease temperature, whereas the occluded leg would not decrease as much. And similarly, the leg where the lower limb was exposed, the blood from the lower part of the leg would cool the upper leg, as opposed to the whole leg being heated. So they thought all those effects would result in more muscle temperature cooling.
Okay.
Yeah.
So getting into the actual study itself, what kind of subjects were they looking at?
Yeah, so they recruited 10 male cyclists, young, fairly typical cyclist build, about 76 kilos, that were training at least 3 cycle sessions per week. So they don't really give a lot in terms of what's their actual level, but they are at least active and they are proper cyclists.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what was the protocol that they used?
The protocol they used was to get the athletes to come into the session and first stabilize them for 30 minutes. So they just had them rest passively for 30 minutes, get their baseline measurement. Then they had them complete a warm-up, which consisted of 5 minutes cycling at 100 watts, and then 5 wind gates at 2-minute periods. So they do 10-second wind gates at 2-minute periods. So 5 minutes light cycling, and then 5 sprints. Then they had that took about 15 minutes altogether. Then they took another 30 minutes for recovery and took measurements after the 30 minutes of recovery. So presumably when they would then start competition. They didn't have a performance measure at the end of that 30-minute recovery from the warm-up. Their justification was that they would not be able to exercise the occluded limb, which they occluded to 140 millimeters mercury.
In our work, we'd realize you'd be able to exercise at 140.
I typically train at 165.
And I'm 190 to 200.
Yes. And admittedly, were probably larger than cyclists, so you do need more pressure to get that occlusion. But I think I'm about 82 kilos and these cyclists are 76. So it's not that much of a difference. And I imagine they have pretty good vascularity. They probably have better vascularity than I do. So
yeah. Sure. So that they've done their warm up, they've done their protocol, and then from this point, what did they do with the muscle temperature, maintaining that?
Yeah, so they got muscle temperature by inserting a needle into the muscle, so proper muscle temperature at 3 different depths. They looked at a deep, a medium, and a superficial depth. And then they also got core temperatures from a rectal thermistor, as well as several other measures. But those are the 2 primary measures, were the muscle temperature and the core temperature, which relates back to a lot of what we've talked about. That ratio between the core temperature versus the muscle temperature is one of the main things that we look at.
So you've set the study up quite nicely there, Jared. What were the different conditions and how did they do it?
So the different conditions, how they've set it up is quite a novel design, in that first what they've done is they've used 2 previous studies that they've completed for prior subjects that they used in those studies with almost the exact same protocol. And so they've used that for their control condition where they don't use any heating elements, and they've used that for their 40-degree electrically heated trousers.
Yep.
So they're comparing their current data from this study to 2 previous studies that they've done.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Great way to kind of pool the data that you get from your different research, as long as the protocols and outcomes are the same and you can compare them. And then what they've done in this study is they've been able to create 4 conditions over just 2 trials by having the occluded limb and the perfused limb. So those are 2 different conditions within an individual athlete. And then they've applied the water perfused trousers, either the pants, the full pants, or just the shorts covering the lower limb.
So have they cycled with them on?
No, these were applied after the warm-up. So the athlete comes in, does the 15-minute warm-up, then puts on the pants, and then recovers for 30 minutes.
So they've done the cycling, they've put the different conditions in. What were the findings?
So the main findings are, first, that the muscle temperature does increase from the warm-up. They saw that at superficial, mid, and deep levels. And then that temperature is largely maintained from post-warm-up to post-recovery at the deep and the mid levels, because it's not really being exposed to environmental conditions, and so it maintains a lot of that temperature. Whereas the superficial continues to rise a bit as that temperature comes from the deep and mid and radiates out to the superficial depth. In terms of the occlusion versus the perfused limb, what they saw were significantly higher muscle temperatures in the occluded limb as opposed to the non-occluded limb. So we see that is quite a bit more temperature there. We see almost an entire degree Celsius increase from the non-restricted limb to the restricted limb.
And that's where, if you actually had a power measure of some sort, if you could do that, that would have been paramount, because most of the time we talk about a degree, as you said earlier, a degree change is about 4 to 11% change in power.
Yeah.
If you could actually quantify that in the one study with the one subject, that would have been a fantastic finding.
Yeah, especially if you had, perhaps, because they're looking at the 2 limbs, it would have been sort of interesting if they could have had a cycle ergometer that the pedals are actually separated.
Yeah.
Or at least you can read the differences between the two pedals, like in a watt bike, and see if that previously occluded limb was actually pushing quite a bit harder or faster.
I'm sure you could.
Yeah, that would have been quite interesting.
Any other findings?
Yep. So also with the muscle temperature, they found that the 43-degree water perfused trousers actually increased the temperature at the mid and superficial levels, whereas the control or 40-degree electrically heated trousers decreased the temperature. And also at the deep level, the 43-degree water perfused trousers attenuated a lot of the loss of temperature, as opposed to the control and 40-degree electrically heated conditions, that there was quite a large drop in temperature, but that wasn't seen nearly as much in the 43 water perfused trouser condition. And finally, with the core temperatures, what they saw were essentially no difference between the full heated trousers versus just the heated shorts. It didn't really affect the core temperature overall.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from a practical application point of view, how do you see taking this out into the real world?
Practically, we see that the 43-degree water perfused trousers are quite a bit better than the 40-degree electrically heated trousers, but obviously water perfused trousers are not very practical in the real world. And although just the upper heating versus the whole limb heating, we saw that there's not really much difference. Obviously, if you can't be applying these perfect conditions with the 43-degree water-perfused trousers, it may still be beneficial to be covering more of that leg if you can't get the ideal conditions, because there's not many conditions where we could create 43 degrees of heating on the limb.
That's right. It comes down to being able to perform some form of passive heat maintenance is better than none.
Yeah. Basically, as much heating as possible appears to be best, up to the absolute tolerance of the athlete. Local heating on the muscle, obviously not central heating.
Yeah. And in closing, any other final thoughts?
In closing, I think it's really interesting with that, with the occlusion on the limb, keeping that warm. I just sort of wonder if that's potentially a little bit of an underlooked mechanism in occlusion training. Yeah, you're pooling that hot muscle blood rather than allowing that to leave and allowing the cool central blood to be coming in. One of the effects of occlusion training might actually be to be keeping the muscle warmer as well.
And some of your lit review work that you've done with your own heat studies, the mechanisms behind increasing muscle temperature, that must have some sort of positive benefit to performance.
Right, absolutely.
And then once again, where, although it wasn't done, how good it would be to have some performance measure in an ideal world show that, the occluded leg slightly warmer.
Right. I think now that quite a bit more is known about blood flow restriction, I think that they certainly could have included that. And also 140 millimeters mercury, probably not really sufficient to be fully occluding the limb.
But you don't really want full occlusion either, which is a good thing. And also, there's still, you look at literature between 75 to 220 mils of mercury, it has positive benefits. And if you're asking for a maximal test, we think 140 would be achievable. Therefore, they could probably do a maximal test and actually get a result that could have been used for publication if that's where their mind was at.
Yeah, true. And because they did that recovery period for 30 minutes. So sitting with one limb restricted for 30 minutes would be a bit uncomfortable, especially for someone not familiar with it at all.
Yeah, and sometimes that's it. If you're not familiar with it as well, do you go down that route?
Right.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Jared.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We hope you've been enjoying our podcast. For more information, please visit our website on snippetscience.com. Pass this on to your friends, retweet, we're on Twitter, and leave a review. We're really interested to see what you think of our podcast, and also leave us suggestions for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening.